Hello, scholars. Welcome back. Today for Monday, we're going to read chapter 6 and 7. I think I'm going to just put it all into one video. So this one video will be chapter 6 and chapter 7. So if you need a break in between, or if you need to wiggle around, or if you're like, I actually need to make a run with my parents, so I don't have time for this, just make sure you have enough time allotted out to sit there and watch me read. Okay? So, guys, last week you should have given me a response. This week you will be doing the same, but this week your response needs to change. Okay? So remember, you only do a response after our next 5 chapters. Okay? Here we go. Chapter 6. Eddie leaned forward eagerly. After all those scary days waiting for Aunt Min to come home to the crack in the wall, finally he would find out what happened. Things were great at first, said Min, adjusting her legs. When I got to the library last Tuesday, it was as glorious as ever. The librarian read one of my favorite books at story time, Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. It's all about food, Eddie, and I must tell you that later, when I was perishing for a bite to eat, I thought of nothing but that book. I dreamed every single day that food would fall from the sky, just as it did in the story. I imagined it falling through the skylight. She gazed towards the skylight, remembering. Aunt Min, said Eddie. Yes. Oh, sorry, Eddie. Yes, last Tuesday. Well, I certainly wasn't hungry then. On the contrary, we had a delicious lunch together, the librarian and I. Egg salad sandwiches. Everything was fine till late afternoon. And then what? Ha! Said Min. Disaster, and no one's fault but my own. I've been wondering about those new things, Eddie. Those books with no paper, and some of the squishers read. Tablets? iPads? Eddie had seen them back in the classroom. He'd been curious himself. Exactly, said Min. The librarian was reading one at her desk. Then a teacher came in, looking for help. Teachers come in here all the time, Eddie. You have to watch out for them. Anyways, the librarian went off and left that thing just sitting there on her desk. I admit, I got rather excited. A chance to satisfy my curiosity once and for all. Wow, said Eddie. Don't cheer yet, said Min. I scurried on over. And at first, it was an adventure, hoisting myself up, getting my bearings. Oh, you see my cat. I felt quite proud of myself. Yay, said Eddie. Aunt Min shook her head. Oh, Eddie, it wasn't at all what I expected. A skating rink, that's what it was. A glass surface. Have you ever tried to walk on glass? And if that wasn't bad enough, it lit up too. Shockingly bright. Got my head in a tiz. But in spite of all that, I did it. I crawled across that thing, slipping and sliding, and I actually read most of the words. Good for you, Aunt Min. But when I got to the end, Aunt Min paused. Her eyes were bulging. What? Catastrophe, said Min. There's something on those things that makes the page turn. Like magic, but not the good kind. All of a sudden, the page started changing under me. I started on 103, but every time I moved, even twitched, it changed. First 104, 105, 106, 107. I couldn't stop it. I was in a panic, scrambling so hard to get off that I fell. Hard. When I tried to stand up, I fell again and again. You try running on that glass. You'll see. Finally, I fell right off the tablet. My legs were so banged up, I could barely crawl. I thought I was a goner. Eddie tried to picture his aunt, legs broken, head muddled, staggering around. Somehow, I dragged myself to this tray, just in the nick of time, too. The librarian came back. And you've been trapped here ever since? Yes, said Min, hiding. The librarian is kind of course, and I'm sure she wouldn't have squished me. But she might very well have thrown me out the window. All with the best of intentions. I saw her do that to a ladybug once. Oh no, we would never have seen you again. Min nodded. We have been so careful. I'll tell you one thing, Eddie. I'll never step on one of those things again. Nothing but paper books for men from now on. Eddie had been secretly longing to try a tablet himself, nodded. Me too. Min cocked her head. Oh, I don't know. Maybe you could figure it out. It would never be the same, said Eddie. It was true. Half of the fun of reading was the paper, the spongy softness beneath his feet, the springiness as he moved from word to word. A burst of laughter interrupted his thoughts. Young squishers, children, on the storytime carpet. Hey, said Eddie, they're reading a funny book. Good, said Min. I could use a laugh. They crept to the front of the paper tray, where they could get a good view. The librarian was sitting in a story-time chair, facing the class of giggling children and holding up a book showing goofy-looking black and white cows. First grade, murmured Aunt Min. What's the book? Asked Eddie. Click, clack, moo. Cows that type. What? Said Eddie. Hey, wait. Cows can't type. Min gave him a playful shove. How do you know? Maybe there's a farm somewhere full of cows who can type. Shh, listen. So they did. The cows in the story were wacky enough to make even an achy old bug like Min laugh. By the end, she and Eddie were giggling along with the children. They returned to their hiding spot reluctantly. Well, that did me good, said Min, just like medicine. Eddie nodded, swayed as if in a strong breeze. Oh, Eddie, you're falling over. Min's huge eyes swiveled to inspect him. Well, of course, you are. You must be exhausted after everything you've done today. What a terrible auntie I am, keeping you awake all this time. Eddie didn't argue. Being mostly nocturnal, he had a hard time staying awake in daylight, even on a normal day. His abdomen drooped. There now, said Min. It's way past your nap time. Why don't you have a nice little snooze? So that's what Eddie did. He found an empty bit of tray and settled down to rest. Eddie, said Min as he drifted off. Thank you, dear. Thank you for coming. All right, we're on to chapter 7. Eddie slept like a rock, or maybe he slept more like a shiny green pebble. Because if you could have peeked at him as he lay there on the bottom of the tray, that's what he would have looked like to you. A small, smooth, still green pebble. Until, bring! At the sound of the bell, Eddie rose to his feet. He glanced around, then trotted to the front of the tray. Hey, Aunt Min, which bell was that? End of the day? See, the children are leaving. Together, they watched as the young squishers wandered off to wherever they spent the night. Tea time now, said Min. The librarian likes to linger for a cup of tea, or for a cup after school. And sure enough, the next sound was water boiling in a kettle at the far end of the library. She has a small office back here, said Min. When the librarian brought her tea to the desk, Eddie was excited to get an up-close view. Gosh, he said, isn't she something? He stretched to get a good look. The librarian was a roundish kind of squisher with a cheerful face and a plump body. Everything about her was colorful. Red hair, purple glasses, turquoise top. She was like a butterfly, said Eddie in astonishment. Hast, Eddie, get down. But Min needn't have worried. The librarian was busy opening a book. A moment later, she chuckled. It was the same book she was reading at lunchtime, whispered Eddie. She was laughing then, too. Do you think she'll leave it behind? Shh, said Min. Together they listened to sipping and clinking and pages turning and now and then laughing. Finally, there was humming as the librarian stood up. Darn, said Eddie as she popped the book into her purse. She put on her coat. It was as red as the ripe apple, and her wool hat was as blue as the evening sky. Eddie looked more closely. Gosh, he said, watching her as she left the library. The librarian is very round, isn't she? Min nodded. Didn't you know? She's going to have a baby. A baby? Just one? Another nod from Min. They only have one baby at a time, those squishers. Silly, isn't it? Hardly worth the trouble. But the bad part is she's going to leave the library. Leave? Eddie twitched uncomfortably. Why? To look after the baby. It's ridiculous, I know. Babies should be able to look after themselves after the first few weeks. And for goodness sakes, there'll only be one. She sighed and continued. Squisher babies are different, helpless, pathetic. Our librarian will be gone for some time. Oh no! Eddie had only known the librarian briefly, but he already felt very fond of her. A new thought struck him. Who's going to look after the library? Min sighed. Don't ask, Eddie. I wish... She stopped. What do you wish? What's wrong? Nothing, said Min. At least nothing yet. I'm just a little nervous, that's all, about what's going to happen when the librarian leaves. But don't you worry. By that time, you'll be home with your family. We both will, said Eddie. Listen, Aunt Min, I've been thinking. Why don't we leave tonight? Go home. We, said Min. Eddie stared back puzzled. Of course, you and me. But Eddie, I don't want to go, said Eddie. But we have to. It was true. In the short time since he'd arrived, he'd been totally enchanted by the library. But Min's safety was more important. We're living on top of a desk, Aunt Min. The most dangerous place in the school. We have to leave. Eddie, said Min slowly, look at me. Look really. Can you see? I'm on my last legs. She wiggled the four that still worked. Even those movements were feeble. Don't say that, Aunt Min. I can help. You can lean on me. She shook her head. Think about it. If we were down on the floor, we might stagger along somehow. But how would I get to the floor? I'll carry you down. Min shook her head again. That's sweet. But remember how hard it was to get a crumb up here. Do you really think you could carry a whole bug down? He didn't answer. He hated that she was right. He was too small. He didn't have enough strength. And a horrible thought crossed his mind. What if he dropped her? But you can't stay here, he cried. You know you can't. Sometimes we don't get a choice, she said. My injuries will take time to heal, and that's fine. I can wait. I'm a tough old bug. But you must go back. Your parents will be frantic. Aunt Min, go. I'll be fine. Eddie gulped. He had never heard such a big, brave lie in his life. Dreamy he might be, even foolish, but he wasn't stupid. Eddie knew, as surely as he knew his own name, what would happen to Min if he left her there, trapped, injured, and unable to get food. No, he said in the firmest voice that he could muster. If you're staying, so am I. What followed next was an excruciating long argument. It would take several pages, in fact, to tell you the details of how Min coaxed and threatened and reminded Eddie over and over about his worried parents, about the example he would set for his brothers and sisters, and about the many risks of staying, which were somehow just fine for her, but much too dangerous for him. All you really need to know is this. Eddie waited patiently till his aunt was finished, then said in a surprisingly certain voice, You're wasting your breath. Min stomped her front foot. Oh, Eddie, when did you get so stubborn? Runs in the family. She tried not to smile. Okay, she said finally. I can't force you, but this makes me responsible. If something were to happen to you, well, honestly, Eddie, your mother would have me for breakfast. Promise me you'll be extremely careful, especially when the squishers are around. I promise. No daydreaming? You'll pay attention? She gave him a sharp look. I promise. Good. Now, it's my turn for a nap. All this excitement since you arrived, I can't believe I've stayed awake all day. Go rest, said Eddie. I'll stand guard while you sleep. Min obeyed, making herself a bed atop a crumpled tissue. Don't wander off now. I won't. Seconds later, she was snoring. Stepping carefully so as not to rattle any papers, Eddie crept out of the tray. He stood guard just as he promised, but after a long period of watchfulness, during which not a single thing happened except for increasingly loud snores from his aunt, he realized there was nothing to guard against. The Squishers had all gone home. He said out loud. He was bored. But how could he be bored? This was a library. He wasn't seeing the library, that was why. And what was the point of being in the library if he didn't experience it? A tingle ran through his feet, tiny but quite thrilling. Eddie laughed, remembering how nervous his feet had been on the journey to the library. Now suddenly, they were brave and wanted to explore. But no, he had promised Aunt Min he'd stay close. His feet argued back. The desk was close, they said. Up till now, Eddie had stayed near the paper tray, but the desk was much larger than that. Eddie could look across it and see the fantastic jumble of things he had noticed when he first arrived, things like the librarian must need in her job. What could they be? As he started to walk, his feet tingled harder. They seemed to have minds of their own. Pencils he found in abundance, also pens. A librarian must have to write many things, thought Eddie. Sure enough, he found some, a list with the heading, Kindergarten Story Time, followed by the titles of 3 books. Another list said, Research on Planets. Eddie's feet carried him on, past a glass bowl filled with gold stars. Behind these rose a giant tape dispenser and a huge box of tissues. Tucked between, like a joke, was a plastic duck. It swung when Eddie pushed it. He had to run to get out of the way. Looming above everything was a computer. Its screen was an enormous blank eye. In the daytime, it must have been filled with bright images. Now it was empty and gray. Smaller gray things, a mystery to Eddie, were attached to the computer. Like a computer family, thought Eddie. A framed photo caught his eye. He scuttled over. The picture showed a man and a woman hugging a curly-haired dog. Eddie recognized the woman immediately. The librarian. Beside the photo was a blue stamp pad left open. Eddie knew all about the stamp pads. The teacher had one in the classroom. Pa had stumbled onto one in the one dark night and had come home blue. He left footprints all over the teacher's desk. Eddie kept his distance from the stamp pad. He found more yellow stickies. They were everywhere. The librarian must really like stickies. He also found a mysterious straw basket woven in lots of different colors. It was wider at the top than at the bottom, which made it extremely difficult to climb. What was inside? Eddie just couldn't stand not knowing. Slowly, with great effort, he hauled himself all the way to the top. It was worth the climb. At first, the odd collection of objects in the basket made no sense. But then, Eddie recognized one, a toy train with a smiling face. Thomas the Tank Engine, he cried. Recognizing Thomas made Eddie suspect that the other objects might also be clues to books. He made a list in his head so he could ask Aunt Min about them later. A purple plastic purse, which we will be reading a little bit later. A box of crayons. A toy pig with big ears wearing a red dress. A little silver jingle bell. A pair of children's glasses with round lenses. A tall hat with red and white stripes. A long feathery pink thing that looked like clothing. When Eddie saw the feathery thing so soft to sleep on, he thought of Aunt Min. He tried to take it back for her, but it was too hard to drag. Fortunately, climbing out of the basket was not hard at all. When Eddie reached the top rim, he just dropped down. His last stop, closest to the librarian's chair, was the best stop of all. The librarian's teacup, the one she had been drinking from earlier. Eddie crept closer, admiring the lavish pink roses. When he reached the saucer, he glanced down, and, yes, there was tea spilt on the saucer. Lovely, clear amber tea, gone cold now. He tested it with his antennae, but still delicious, as he discovered when he took a sip. Aunt Min would be so pleased. Bursting with his news, he ran back to tell her, but she was still in a deep snooze. Muttered Eddie. He settled down to wait. He watched the clouds drift in snowy puffs across the skylight. He stared out at the trees, their leaves shimmering in the late afternoon sun. He thought about his parents, and then stopped because he was almost positive they were angry with him. However angry they might be, he knew what he had to do. Look after Aunt Min. He checked on her again. He repeated. He wiggled, he stretched, he stared at his feet, tingling again. And that's when Eddie, or possibly his feet, figured something out. At that moment, the library was his, all his. Not just the paper tray, not just the desk, the whole magnificent, glorious, magical room. For however long it lasted, this library and every book in it belonged to a bug named Eddie. He might never have this chance again. All right, guys, that was it for chapter 7. Make sure you do your response if you haven't already for next week, and I'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.